What happens when the world's biggest star dies? The music stops, the dancing ends, but the questions begin. For Michael Jackson, the questions were bigger than for most. His life was a public spectacle, a grand performance that never seemed to end. Yet, behind the gates of his rented mansion, behind the closed door of his bedroom, was a world no one had ever truly seen. This was where the final act of his life played out. It was a place of secrets. People wanted to know what happened in those last hours. They wanted to understand the man, not just the legend. The answers, it turned out, were waiting inside that room. On June 25, 2009, news of Michael Jackson's death shocked the entire world. He was found unresponsive in his home in the Holmby Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles. He was preparing for a massive comeback tour called This Is It. The tour was supposed to be his great return, a final triumph to reclaim his throne as the king of pop. Instead, his life ended suddenly at the age of 50. The world mourned the loss of a musical genius. But as the grief settled, a deep curiosity rose. What was his life really like at the end? The police investigation into his death would soon open the door to his most private space, offering a glimpse into his final lonely days. When investigators stepped into Michael Jackson's bedroom, they did not find the lavish, opulent palace one might expect. The room was not a king's chamber. Instead, it was a space filled with a strange mix of order and chaos. It was part hospital room, part child's playroom, and part artist's retreat. The atmosphere was heavy and still, a silent testament to the struggle that had taken place there. It was immediately clear that this was not just a place for rest. It was a place where a man was fighting a difficult battle, surrounded by the things that gave him comfort and the things that were leading to his demise. The room itself was large, with elegant furniture and soft lighting, but the personal touches were what made it so unique and unsettling. On one side, you had the signs of a medical emergency. On the other, you had the symbols of innocence and childhood. It was a room of contradictions. It felt like two different worlds had collided within its four walls. One world was that of a sick man, dependent on powerful drugs to function. The other was that of a gentle soul, clinging to the purity and wonder of youth. Every surface seemed to be covered with something. There were clothes strewn on a chair, as if he had just taken them off. There were stacks of books and DVDs, showing a mind that was still curious and active. But there were also strange and random items that seemed out of place. The room felt lived in, but in a frantic, disorganized way. It was the sanctuary of a man who was isolated from the outside world, creating his own cluttered reality. It was a deeply personal space, and seeing it felt like reading a private diary that was never meant to be shared with anyone. The most shocking discovery in Michael Jackson's bedroom was the sheer amount of medical equipment and drugs. It looked less like a bedroom and more like a private clinic. Next to his bed was an IV pole, the kind you see in a hospital, with a saline bag still attached. There were numerous oxygen tanks scattered around the room, some large and some small. On his bedside table and on other surfaces were dozens of prescription pill bottles. There were sedatives, painkillers, and anesthetics. The most significant of these was propofol, a powerful anesthetic used in surgery, which Michael called his milk. This was not a normal setup for a home. These items told a clear and tragic story. Michael was suffering from chronic insomnia. He was desperate for sleep, so desperate that he had turned his bedroom into a personal operating room to get it. He had hired a doctor, Conrad Murray, to be with him and administer these powerful drugs every night. The presence of the IV stand and the propofol vials showed that he was receiving anesthesia just to be able to rest. It was an extremely dangerous and unconventional practice. It revealed the depth of his desperation and how far he was willing to go to escape his sleepless nights and the immense pressure he was under. The collection of medications was vast and varied. There were bottles of Valium, lorazepam, and midazolam, all powerful sedatives. Alongside them were other drugs for anxiety and pain. It was a pharmacy of powerful substances, all within arm's reach of his bed. This collection showed a long history of reliance on prescription medication. It was a habit that had likely developed over many years, perhaps starting with treatments for pain from his performance injuries or the burns he suffered during a Pepsi commercial shoot. The bedroom was the epicenter of this dependency, the place where his search for relief reached its fatal conclusion. The medical scene painted a grim picture of his final months. He was not simply taking a sleeping pill. He was undergoing a nightly medical procedure that put his life at risk. The oxygen tanks were there in case he stopped breathing, a known side effect of the drugs he was taking. This setup was a clear sign that both he and his doctor knew the dangers involved. Yet, they continued. The medical items found in his room were not just clues, they were the very instruments of his death. They told a story of a man who had lost his way, seeking a solution in medicine that medicine was never meant to provide. Beyond the medical chaos, Michael Jackson's room was filled with objects that spoke to a very different side of his personality. Perhaps the most touching and talked about discovery was the presence of dolls and children's toys. A porcelain doll with blonde hair and a frilly dress was found sitting on his bed, right next to where he slept. There were other figures and toys nearby, reminiscent of a child's bedroom. For a 50-year-old man, these items seemed strange to many people, but for Michael, they were deeply significant. They represented the childhood he felt he never had, a time of innocence he was always trying to recapture. The room also contained many personal notes and affirmations. Scattered around were sticky notes with handwritten messages on them. Some were simple reminders or creative ideas. Others were more profound, like self-encouraging phrases and words of inspiration. One note, stuck to a mirror, listed parts of his show he needed to practice. Another contained a list of affirmations, reminding himself of his talent and strength. These notes showed a man who was actively trying to stay positive and focused, despite his inner turmoil. They were glimpses into his mind, showing his dedication to his art and his struggle to keep his spirits up. The decorations in the room were also quite peculiar. On a dresser, there were pictures of unidentified babies and children, cut from magazines and placed in frames. This was perhaps the most curious detail of all. It was not clear why he had these pictures of strangers' children. Some speculate it was part of his connection to the idea of childhood innocence. Others find it unsettling. Whatever the reason, it added another layer of mystery to the man. It showed that even in his most private space, he surrounded himself with images of youth and purity, creating a world that was far removed from his adult reality. These objects, the dolls, the notes, the pictures, provide a much softer, more vulnerable portrait of Michael Jackson. They stand in stark contrast to the harsh reality of the medical equipment. They show a man who was not just a patient, but also a dreamer. He was someone who found comfort in the symbols of childhood and who used words to build himself up. These items reveal his humanity. They show his longing for a simpler, more innocent world, and his constant effort to create that world for himself, even if it was just within the four walls of his bedroom. It was a space of deep emotional complexity. When you put all the pieces together, the contents of Michael Jackson's bedroom paint a full and heartbreaking portrait of his final days. It was a room of dualities. It was a medical facility and a child's nursery. It was a creative space and a scene of a tragedy. Each object tells a part of his story, revealing the complex layers of the man behind the iconic mask of the King of Pop. The room shows us a person who is simultaneously a powerful artist, planning a global comeback, and a fragile individual fighting a losing battle against his inner demons. It was the private stage for his last and most tragic performance. The collection of items forces us to see Michael Jackson in a new light. For years, the world debated who he was. Was he a brilliant genius or a strange recluse? The bedroom suggests he was both and much more. The medical items reveal his immense suffering and the desperate measures he took to cope with it. The toys and notes reveal his gentle, almost childlike soul, and his deep-seated need for comfort and innocence. It is easy to judge these things from the outside, but inside that room, they were simply the elements of his reality, the things he gathered around him to survive each day. Ultimately, the bedroom stands as a powerful symbol of his isolation. In a life lived in the constant glare of the public eye, this room was his only true refuge, but it was also his prison. It was here that he was most himself, surrounded by his fears and his comforts. The objects left behind are like artifacts from a forgotten civilization, each one offering a clue to understanding the man who lived there. They show us that behind the moonwalk, the single glove, and the hit songs, there was a human being who was struggling with pain, pressure, and profound loneliness, just like anyone else. The story of what was found in Michael Jackson's bedroom is not just about satisfying curiosity. It is a deeply human story. It reminds us that behind every legend, there is a person with their own unique set of struggles and complexities. The room serves as a final, silent biography, written not in words, but in the objects he chose to keep close. It is a sad but important epilogue to the life of an artist who gave so much to the world, but who could not, in the end, save himself. The memory of that room is a lasting testament to the magic, the madness, and the whole story of Michael Jackson.